Hi, and welcome to the CAFMA Connect. I'm your host, Fire Chief Scott Freitag, and with me today, Assistant Chief Dave Tharp. Dave, welcome back. Let me give you a little applause. Thank you, Jonah.
This is 2 weeks in a row. I don't know what the heck is going on.
It is, and we didn't get that many views last week. I don't remember what we talked about, but it was pain, back pain, things like that.
It was pain.
It was pain.
That's all he remembers.
People were pained, so they didn't watch it.
It was
That's
the
right.
thumbnail. That's why no one clicked on
The
it.
I like the thumbnail, Jonah. I appreciate it. Well, I think this week's thumbnail and the content that we're going to talk about will get some attention, Dave, because we've had the social media post. People have seen it. We've talked a little bit in the community, and there's signs up now, and it's about Proposition 310. And a disclaimer up front, you and I are not advocating for anyone to vote one way or the other for Prop 310. We are simply here to provide answers to questions that we've been asked regarding from the community. What is Prop 310? Pretty straightforward. We'll answer that. Well, how are you funded? And a lot of people were surprised, as you found out recently at the Prescott Valley Chamber. A lot of people really don't understand how we receive our funding.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to talk about that dirty word that nobody likes to talk about, which is taxes. And everybody, as soon as we hear that you want taxes, then immediately people start saying, well, I'm not voting for it. That's just a tax increase. It's never going away. It's always going to be there and all that kind of stuff. And I appreciate that.
Sure, I get it.
Because taxes are kind of those unnecessary evils that people always sit
necessary evil.
Well, in certain cases, it's definitely
Yeah.
necessary, but in some cases, they view it as being an unnecessary evil that I don't want to have to pay for.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and some of the folks that are out campaigning against Prop 310, or at least handing out flyers, they have some fiery rhetoric. Some fiery sound bites, but they lack any factual information. I did an interview yesterday with Cronkite News out of ASU, and they asked me, hey, this group is handing out this, and they're saying that you're being irresponsible with the funds that you do have. And my response to that was, one, I disagree with what they're saying. They're not providing any factual basis for the narrative or the soundbite that fire districts are irresponsible and therefore shouldn't be allowed to have any more funding. Yeah. Show me where.
Yeah.
There's no factual basis to it. And I pointed out that the reality is, and we'll talk about Prop 117 today as part of this, but they also supported Prop 117, which really kind of got us into some of this, these difficult situations we're in today regarding our funding.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. I think that there's unintended consequences in anything that people do for the legislature in the whole, right? You're trying to do the best you can for the general consensus, and I think that there were unintended consequences when that proposition was passed.
Right.
But I also think that in this particular realm, this proposition can really help a lot of districts, fire districts, and not just our fire district, but a lot of rural ones.
Very rural.
Yeah, ones that literally have volunteers or hardly any resources. I'm thinking of organizations that we donate our fire apparatus to, that we allow to come to our training facility, that barely have enough equipment to be able to even show up at a structure fire. This will be a huge game changer for them.
Oh, it absolutely will. And these are the same agencies that go to fire school based on scholarships.
Yeah, sure.
Try to get into higher level training for their chief officers, because some have said, well, fire chiefs and boards are making mistakes. Well, there's training out there for them. They're required to go to it. There's no additional funding that allows them to get into the training. So if they could be funded to a point where, hey, we can seek out this training, we can have more professional background and exposure to how to handle the finances of a fire district, it would certainly be an improvement over where we are today if 310 were to pass.
Right.
And we're not asking anybody to pass. We're not asking anybody to vote for it. It's just, that's a fact. There are a lot of agencies, especially in very rural areas, that are struggling today with funding because of the lack of property tax, the lack of growth in their area, the limits that Prop 117 placed on property taxes and funding for fire districts. And at the same time, we are all, you, me, people from Phoenix, we are all traveling through those areas hoping that if we get into a car crash or have a medical emergency, that someone will be able to respond with the right kind of equipment and the right training to be able to care for us. And if you think about it, once you hit Black Canyon City, the last Daisy Mountain station right off the highway, until you get to Flagstaff, you're in fire district territory, but there are very few resources that can be mustered along that I-17 corridor. And then once you hit Flagstaff, between Flagstaff and Kingman on the 40, again, you're in very rural fire district areas where trying to get resources and provide training for personnel and having volunteers available is very limited. Yet you're driving along happy-go-lucky, hoping that if you get into a crash, somebody responds. And that's a question.
I wouldn't even say hoping, Scott, because I think there's a lot of people out there that just expect. They expect that, hey, if I get into a wreck or if my loved one has a heart attack or all of a sudden my child is choking, that if I pull over and I call 911 because I've got 911 service on my phone, that I'm getting 911 response. And unfortunately, there's a lot of areas that aren't covered. And if they are covered, just like you said, it's very rural. They may take a long time to get there. And I think that's why the messaging from this is, hey, help us to help you get better response times and better training and better, more equipment and personnel.
Right. So. Well, and we had somebody respond on our social media to one of our posts, a fact-based post about what 310 is. And the individual was concerned. He felt like we were saying we are cutting services if Prop 310 doesn't pass. And that was not the message at all.
No.
Our underlying districts are able to provide services at the level that we are at today. The challenge for us as CAFMA and the underlying Central Yavapai and Chino Valley fire districts is that keeping up with demand, and we'll talk about why that's a challenge as part of this informational program. But yeah, we can respond today where we're at, but our response times are getting longer. And as we see some of the growth and construction in the area and how that's expanding, and talk about, hey, development doesn't pay for development in fire districts like it does in municipalities and towns, then there are challenges there, and how are we going to meet those?
Right.
So, Jonah, what is Prop 310, Dave? Well, we know it's a 1/10 of a cent sales tax, equates to about 1 penny for every dollar, not about, equates to 1 penny for every dollar, and $10 for every $100 purchase.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at an overall tax basis, it's pretty minuscule, but I get it. A lot of people are like, hey, listen, I don't want to give you one more penny than I already have to. And I think another part of this is that it is not affecting food sales. A lot of people are at the grocery store. A lot of people think my grocery bill keeps going up all the time anyways, but this actually will not affect that. It will affect services. It will affect if you buy a vehicle. It will affect those types of things. But again, we're asking for pennies here.
Right. And not on grocery purchases. So Rockstar, who is not a sponsor, it doesn't impact me.
Yeah.
When I pick up a Rockstar at the grocery store.
Food sales, it doesn't. If you do go out and have a nice dinner, though, yes, for every $10 that you spend, you'll be paying for a penny towards fire service.
And we do encourage everyone to go to the Secretary of State's website, read more information about Prop 310. We're not asking anyone to vote either way, but we would ask that you be informed. Even if you vote against it because we know it's a tax, just be informed and understand what it is.
Right.
Okay. Next up, what do we have? Municipal versus fire district funding. And this is an area, Dave, that you were at the chamber, you've been some other places, and you said, wow, people didn't realize that fire districts really have one source of funding, and that's property tax.
Right. Whenever I have talked to people, a lot of times they don't understand. It's no different when we talk about diversifying your portfolio, right? You want to be able to say, hey, I have multiple ways in which I have income, so that if one income source isn't doing so well, then I still have another income source that kind of helps bolster that. What we've noticed is that cities and towns and municipalities, they have multiple ways in which they can raise funds, and they have multiple venues for that. And there's nothing against that.
No, not at all.
It's all in state statute. It allows them to do it, or they have home rule that they can create those fee structures and things like that. But there's state shared revenues. They already receive HERF funds and VLAT, what they call vehicle licensing tax funds for every vehicle that's on the road that gets registered. Towns and cities and municipalities receive a portion of those funds. Fire districts do not. We are beholden upon the people that live in our jurisdiction to be able to pay for our emergency services. And you say to yourself, well, what's the big deal? Those are the people that primarily use it. I want to give you one scenario.
Really.
Yeah, I want to give you one scenario. Tucson Fire District, which is located on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. They have 60 residents, 60, and they get over 5 million visitors through there every single year, and their fire department is taxed to the rim as far as their resources. They do not have a very big fire department, and yet they have to deal with all of the emergency traffic that happens on that highway for millions of travelers every single year. And I think that to say that those 60 residents have to bear the emergency services for everybody that comes and visits their community, I think is kind of an unfair assignment to that.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. I don't think a lot of people understand that when you are visiting an area that is served by a fire district, the money that you spend, none of that sales tax actually goes to help fund that fire district. So there's several areas in the state of Arizona, I think Mount Lemon's another one, where they have a very small fire district there that has a very small property tax base. That's their only funding source. And yet they have millions of visitors every year, and those visitors are all using those emergency services, but they're not receiving any funding for that. Only the property taxpayers are paying for that. And for us, we do have some fees for service, but that doesn't amount to a lot. We'll talk more about what FDAT is, but when we look at a comparable between us and the city of Prescott, you see sales tax, city of Prescott has property tax, state shared revenues, the other HERF and VLAT funds that you mentioned. Because they're a home rule city, they were able to do something about their pension debt by passing Prop 443, and we commend them for that effort. That was fantastic. As a fire district, we can't do that. Fees for service, impact fees, that's important because we're going to talk about how in a municipality with a fire department, development does help or can help pay for development, whereas in a fire district, development doesn't pay for development at all. And then COVID-19 relief funds, we have a little bit on that. But the reality is people don't realize, and here's an example, Dave, from right here in Prescott Valley. So we just had the Prescott Valley Outdoor Summit. Fantastic event. Thousands of people from all over this state, neighboring states, all descended upon Prescott Valley. We had to staff up to ensure that we could support that event. All the sales tax receipts that were generated as part of the event from people purchasing things at the Outdoor Summit or eating at restaurants or staying in hotels or stopping by Walmart or some of the other stores, all of those sales tax receipts go directly to the town of Prescott Valley. CAFMA receives none of it. Central Yavapai Fire District, the underlying, receives none of that. So for the services we provided, that was just an expense to our taxpayers who are only the property owners within our jurisdictional boundaries.
Right.
That's it. So that goes in as an expense with no revenue line to offset it in the budget. And as you said, basic business 101 is diversify your revenue source.
Yep.
So let's talk more. I think the next one's about FDAT, if I remember correctly. Nope, Prop 117, further limiting. We will go back to FDAT, but Prop 117 really is a regressive tax structure. And it was passed, Dave, you were here when it was passed. I think I came in after it was passed, but as they were implementing it. So was that passed in 2013 or 2012?
Actually, it was passed a little bit before that in 2008. but it wasn't implemented just because of how it was written. It wasn't implemented until 2012.
Okay.
And so what ended up happening is that we ended up, that was when, after the Great Recession, you'd already lost 50% of all the property valuation in that time. And then they had passed this Prop 117 that basically said, hey, listen, the maximum that you're going to be able to levy on the property or increase the valuation of that property is by 5%. And what that did is it basically turned around and said, hey, listen, for any type of economic recovery that's going to happen, and we're seeing that right now in this area, you're not going to be participating with that. And I think that that's where, for me, especially when I read through the proposition, I was kind of really trying as much as possible saying, this is not going to work out long term for this organization or for any organization.
No.
And keep in mind that the limited property values, it doesn't take into account cash values or what they call retail values or what's happening in the marketplace. It basically just trudges along at 5%, and then that's it. You can see just from inflation this year at 8.3%, we're not even meeting what our inflationary costs are.
Not even close.
And so I think that that's where we then have to raise our tax levy to be able to meet some of those needs. And we explain that to our board this year. But people out in the public, they have to do the same thing. Like they have to try to meet those needs the best they can. And I think that that's where it struggles, because now they're getting taxed more. And on top of that, they're turning around and saying, hey, listen, why? My value of my property is going through the roof. How come you guys aren't making enough money?
Right, because the limited value doesn't keep up with that. So just to clarify it a little bit, Prop 117, there are two values set on a home in the state of Arizona, and I think we're one of the only states that does this. There's the full cash value or retail value of the home, and then there's a limited value that upon initial completion of construction and sale, the limited value is set 10% below the full cash value. So a $300,000 home would have been set about $270,000. Now we know you can't find anything up here for $300,000 today, but let's go back to 2013 and say that you bought a brand new home for $300,000. Your limited cash value was set at $270,000, and then the amount that a fire district could tax you on that limited value was limited to go up only 5% a year. So $270,000 and then only 5% a year. Meanwhile, fast forward to today, where that same house probably sells for $600,000, $700,000. What the new homeowner of that home is paying in property taxes is really based off of what was set on a $300,000 value, not a $600,000 or $700,000 value. So the two are not connected in any way. And I've heard that in the community. My property value is through the roof. You should be raking in money. And the fact is, well, because of Prop 117, there's no way for us to deal with that. We can't even keep up with the market and demand. So that's Prop 117. It's regressive tax structure is truly what it is.
Yeah, and I mean, the people at the time promoted it as being, hey, listen, this is going to make it so that if you're on a fixed income, that you're not going to see these massive increases year over year over year because your valuation of your property goes through the roof. And in one aspect, it absolutely handled that. But on the flip side of that, it also said, even if you sell the house, even if you sell it multiple times, even if you're flipping it, specifically because you're trying to get thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the property value, it's not going to reset.
No, it doesn't do anything for us. Yeah. And I know this is the wrong place to compare us to California. I don't like to do that. What I will say is back when California wasn't what they are today, they passed Prop 13, which did basically the same thing, only I believe it was full cash value because they didn't have the limited. But they quickly realized the regressive nature of that structure and that you can't keep up. And so they passed a correction to that, so to speak, where the property value resets upon sale of the home, so you're not just forever behind.
Right.
Next. Need to get a clicker over here so I can click it. So fire department assistance tax. This is one, someone said you're double taxing me because I'm already paying for the fire department assistance tax. And folks really didn't know what that was. So we're going to do our best to explain it. Basically, there are areas in the state of roadway that are not protected by anybody. They're not in anybody's jurisdiction. And the intent of the FDAT was to reimburse, especially rural fire districts, for response into areas where otherwise no one would be responsible for coming to your emergency. So think about it. You're in one of these areas where there's just no one, and you have a crash, and the response from 911 is there's nobody to send. FDAT is in place specifically for that. It's been there for years. In our budget, it equates to around $400,000.
Yeah, it's capped at $400,000.
Right.
So there's no more funds that you can get beyond that. And what it does is it's most people see it on their property tax bill. If they look closely enough, they'll see whatever jurisdiction that they happen to be in. If they're under a fire department, if they're not, if they're just kind of out in the no man's land, like you were talking about, they still have that FDAT.
Right.
Because if they're property owners, they're still paying into that. But
it's not for coverage of their property.
That's right.
It's just for coverage in areas where no one else would respond.
But a lot of people have the misconception that, oh, well, I'm paying for this little tax, so therefore I have fire protection. And we've had actually people come in and ask us about this, and we're like, that's not what that's for. The FDAT, just like you said, it's limited at $400,000 a year. That's all we get.
And that's for us. Rural agencies receive far less.
Way less, because we are one of the largest. In fact, we're like the second largest fire district in Arizona, or fire agency that's fire district based in Arizona. We actually get the maximum. But for a lot of organizations, just like we were talking about, the smaller rural organizations,
right,
they get like literally hardly any money. That's why they have to have bake sales and things like that to be able to raise money.
Right. Well, just for quick clarification, just for my buddy Brad Bradley, Fire Chief of Northwest, my buddy Randy Carr, Fire Chief of Golden Ranch, and then Mark Burdick, Fire Chief of AFMA. I think we're third or fourth now.
Oh, well, okay.
I'm just trying not to upset people. Jonah, you wanted to say something?
Bake sales?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Williamson Valley
fundraisers
and others absolutely do fundraisers and bake sales to be able to raise funds so that they can be able to meet the needs.
Yep. Click. There we go. I just say click and it happens. So development doesn't pay for development, unlike municipal departments. Fire districts in the state are not allowed to assess an impact fee. That's a violation of statute. Yes, we know we should be able to do that, but when you go to the legislature and say, hey, we want to be able to assess impact fees, I can scroll out a list of people who are against the idea of impact fees for fire districts. But here's the bottom line. As development continues to grow and the demand continues to grow based on that development, developers are not required to invest any monies in emergency services infrastructures and fire district jurisdictions. So when they build out a significant area that all of a sudden requires, the demand there requires us to put up a fire station, all of the property owners in that fire district are funding whatever infrastructure we build. And typically we have to go out to bond in order to get the monies to raise the revenue that we need to build fire stations, especially at today's construction cost of $6 to $8 million. Now, this is part of explaining fire district funding. It's not necessarily related to Prop 310, but when a fire district comes out and says, hey, we need to meet demand, and that means we need to add additional infrastructure in, we're coming to you as the taxpayers because the developers aren't required to cover that cost.
Yeah, I mean, we can ask nicely of
Right.
developers and see if they will donate. And in some cases, they've donated land to us, but very, very rarely do they do anything beyond that. And I think that on top of that is, it's not that they're trying to manage their costs as well, right? Because if they're building a $6 million fire station in the middle of their subdivision, well, then that cost gets passed along to all of the residents within that subdivision. But on the flip side of that, now we're coming back and we're asking all the existing residents and saying to them, hey, can you help us to be able to fund a new fire station or put on personnel for this emergency influx. And I think that what we've seen, especially in our organization in the last few years, almost a 30% increase in call volume.
Right.
And we're like, wait a second, we don't have a 30% increase in our personnel.
Right.
And we don't have a 30% increase in the number of fire engines or the number of stations that we have.
Right.
We're still making do with what we have. And we even see on the horizon, there's a lot of people that are moving into
Right.
this area. I would venture to say that if anybody looks at their tax rolls, they'll see that, especially if they're moving into a brand new house, they'll see at least 2 years, if not 3 years, of way less tax payments. And then all of a sudden they'll see, oh, now my house hit the tax rolls.
Because it's paid on agricultural and not on the value of the property of the home.
Right, even though they've been in the house for a couple of years. And then that's when we still have to provide those services.
Yeah, which creates additional demand.
Right.
So it's certainly a challenge for us to come up with those funds to build the station. And we have had some developers who've donated land that ended up being in a navigable waterway of the United States, which creates its own challenges. So we traded it back. But I know large community builders like Del Webb, Ropes and Homes, they, as part of the communities they build the fire stations. So the property owners are then responsible for funding the personnel and equipment on an ongoing basis, but they actually build the fire station. And Karen Ropes and Taylor, who had been running for governor, she visited with me at one point and said, "What do you mean development's not paying for development? That's crazy." So, Ms. Taylor, I'll be reaching out to you again because she had some tips and concepts that I might be able to share with developers to help them commit to at least some level of funding for infrastructure. But that's a long shot, but it's worth a try.
It's worth a try, and I think that's where trying to work with your city or town, like in our particular case, where we're trying to work with the town development,
right,
for planned area developers
Sure.
to be able to try to get something. But unfortunately, like you said, they realize it's not a requirement.
Yep.
You can't force this on us, so why would we do this?
Jonah, can you click the button again? Next one. So we talked about this, and what we're looking at in this picture in the background is Glassford Hill. You can kind of see Glassford Hill Road, and you can kind of see back behind Granville. So we have Granville in the foreground. Back behind it is where Jasper is popping up. You can see tremendous growth there. And folks have said to me, you should be raking in the cash because of all this new development. But as you just pointed out, we're required to provide services to those properties for it's over 2 years before we actually start receiving revenue based on property taxes and value of the home. It's based on the value of the agricultural land. And I say over 2 years because as soon as you put construction personnel on site, we're responsible for providing services. So we have the demand for service for nearly 2.5 years before we actually start seeing the revenue for service. Jonah, can you go to the next slide? And let's take a look at this. This is a video for those of you who are watching on YouTube, but look at the development along 169 and Fane Road. And if you look at Quailwood, the big development right here, if you look behind it, there's a proposal for another large development, which we're okay with. We're good with the idea of the development. But when folks look at this, I want them to understand that all these new properties here, there's demand for service today, but there's no revenue generated other than agricultural, which is a very small amount, for at least 2.5 years. And then the homes in Quailwood, most of those, or a lot of them, were built around 2013, 14, where the values were much lower, so the limited value was set much lower. Today, the home value is much higher, but the limited value, again, is still based on that original value of the home, much lower than today's value.
Yeah.
And that creates a challenge. But we're responsible for this. Development's not paying for development. So we need money to build $6 to $8 million fire station plus hire personnel. And our data today shows we're one 24-hour engine, so one full-time 24/7 engine behind today. But based on current projections from property tax, we're looking about 4 years of incremental property tax increases to be able to hire the personnel that we would need to staff that engine. And even then, without a bond at this point, we have no ability to build the fire station. So there, again, diversified revenue source. How do we generate revenue enough to cover development and demand?
Well, and I think that's where, like you said, we're basically placing the entire burden on the property owners in
Absolutely.
this area. And I think that anybody who lives in this area knows that we have a huge influx of tourism throughout the year to this area. And so if we can help spread that
Right.
cost sharing, if you will, throughout the entire area, including to those that come visit us from other states, and be able to then have them help us to be able to, as people are developing, and we know that we're getting a lot of people from other states that move here.
Oh yeah.
That, hey, listen, maybe we can also help, pay for some of these developing problems that we're seeing
Right.
through this proposition. I think that makes sense.
Right. So another thing people may not be aware of COVID funding. So fire districts federally were cut out of COVID funding. The second round of COVID funds, they did signal to states, cities, towns, counties who were receiving millions, and in the case of the state, billions of dollars in COVID relief, that they were allowed to provide some reimbursement for fire districts in their state if they wanted to. And so far in Yavapai County, no one has wanted to reimburse fire districts for any of the cost of the services we've provided. Now, we have worked at the state level. There is the potential for some funding, but it's not going to be near what we've spent, what our expenses are. And unlike the millions of dollars that were just handed out to cities and counties and states to do whatever, we're going to have to provide receipts for what we spent to prove we spent it, and then we may get a fraction of that amount of money back. And it's not a small amount. When I looked at the numbers you put together today, you're talking close to just shy of $1 million. And a lot of that, a large portion of it has to do with workers' compensation rates and assessments that we're seeing as fire districts directly as a result of COVID. So at this point, no funding for that. The federal government cut us out of all funding, and we're just in a place where we didn't get millions of dollars for this. So we're still looking for ways to make up those shortfalls.
Yeah, and I think that was a impact that occurred. I mean, obviously, back when COVID was going on, and even when there was a request that everybody lock down
Right.
and stay in your home, that didn't mean that all the emergency services stopped either.
Right.
We still, and in fact, our increase during that time frame was significant, and so we still had to provide services and go through and pay for, if you will, support those services.
Right.
And unfortunately, during that time frame, also, we were hopeful that we would get a little bit of some of those funds.
Right.
We weren't, but we're hopeful that we'll get some more here in the next
We'll get
year.
something.
And then the other thing is that again, that's kind of borne on just the property owners.
Right.
It didn't matter whether it was somebody visiting from out of town or anything else. It was borne on for the property owners.
And we're grateful to be able to have provided the services that we provided throughout the pandemic, the services to the Prescott Valley Outdoor Summit. What a great event, and we'll look forward to participating next year. But I think the point is, what we need people to understand is that all of those things are expense lines in our budget. There's not a revenue line to offset that. And all of our costs are solely borne by the property tax owners, both commercial and homeowners within our jurisdictional boundaries. So Dave, just closing out, if Prop 310 is passed, it would provide much needed funding for Arizona fire districts. I think we all know and understand that. Just hitting on those things that you and I were talking about before we started recording today. A lot of folks didn't realize we have one real funding source. That funding source is severely limited by Prop 117, so regressive tax structure. The costs for everything we do are borne only by the property taxpayers within our jurisdictional boundaries. And the fourth point is, if Prop 310 were to pass, it's not a tax on your groceries. It's a tax on other goods and services. 1/10 of a cent, so 1 penny for every dollar and $10 for every $100, or $1 for every $100 that you spend. It would certainly diversify revenue for fire districts, but we encourage you simply go to the Secretary of State's website, take a look, ask questions of your fire district representatives so that you understand what the prop is, what the prop isn't, and just make an informed decision, whatever that is.
Right. No, and I agree. I think that in closing, we're not telling you that you should or shouldn't do this. Our organization and the services we provide, I think, are excellent for this area, and we will continue to try to provide those services. Just like you said, for the future, I'm a little bit concerned because I know that we have tax increases that are forecasted for the residents that live here.
Right.
And people don't get very happy when you increase their property taxes.
No.
If we can, stave off some of those increases or lessen some of that just because of the fact that we've diversified our revenue stream,
Sure.
that can be significant for the future of this organization.
Well, if we look at our data today, as we mentioned, we're one 24/7 engine behind, so 24-hour-a-day engine. It could take us 4 years under our current funding structure to be able to hire enough people to staff an engine, for which we wouldn't have a station for, but at least we'd have some ability to meet demand as response times continue to increase. But if our data today, based on development, based on just the pictures we saw here, based on that development, our data today shows we're behind. How far behind are we in 4 years? We could be another 1 to 2 engines behind, beyond the one that we might be able to fund then.
Right.
So we need to find a way for fire districts in the state to receive the funding necessary to provide the necessary services. How we do that, Prop 310 is an option if the voters approve it. If not, then we have to look for other sources. And while Prop 310 passes, we could certainly hire people more quickly. We can shore up our capital reserve accounts. If it doesn't, then we'll have to find other ways. Just know that those other ways are on the shoulders solely of the property owners within our fire district and not anybody else that visits within our jurisdictional boundaries and requires the use of our services.
Or visits within the entire state.
Right. True.
That's
true.
Okay,
and that's for us, but across the state of Arizona. Yeah. So for everyone out there, we appreciate you tuning in this week. For those that are listening on a podcast platform and not watching YouTube, if you want to see the video, go to YouTube because we do have some slides up. We appreciate the office making these look way better than I did when I put it together. Just closing out, we're not asking anybody to vote one way or another. We're recommending that you go to the Secretary of State's website for more information. Hopefully this has been educational and helpful for folks. Understanding how fire districts actually receive funding in the state of Arizona. It is not a great system, I can tell you that. But with that, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.